Yes.
Sir, would you introduce yourself and spell your name for us, please?
I am Chad Craig, C-H-A-D-C-R-A-I-G,
And how are you currently employed?
as a sergeant for the Columbia Police Department.
What's your present duty assignment?
The supervisor of the training and recruiting unit.
I'm sorry, did you say training and recruiting?
Yes.
Okay. Let me ask you if you can just get a little closer to that microphone. What are your responsibilities as the supervisor of training and recruitment?
I coordinate all training for the department, in service and outside training that is hosted by our department. Oversee all the department instructors, and keep track of training records.
And you're a sergeant?
Yes.
Okay. In August and September of 2011, what was your duty assignment?
I believe I was a patrol officer.
And did you have any specialty assignments?
I was the lead defensive tactics instructor.
Did you say the lead defensive tactics instructor?
Yes.
So that means you're in charge of the program?
Yes, I coordinated all the use of force instructors that put on training for our department.
And you would also teach yourself, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, you were a field training officer?
Yes.
You were on the forensic evidence team?
Yes.
Patrol rifle operator?
Yes.
You have been a certified instructor in what used to be called PPCT since 1994, is that right? That's a little early, isn't it?
No, I believe that's correct.
Okay, so nearly 20 years as a certified instructor of, now it's called Warrior Science Group, right?
It's changed again. It's now Human Factors Research Group.
Okay, and regardless of what we call it, I'm going to refer to it as PPCT, is that all right?
Yes.
Okay. Tell us what the PPCT system is.
It is a basic defensive tactics and use of force program that is designed to give a very elementary use of force tactics and understanding for officers who have not had any prior training.
And it involves teaching the officers certain techniques, correct?
Correct.
Okay. There's joint manipulation, yes.
Yes.
Pressure points, takedowns,
Yes.
strikes.
Yes.
Now, you also, at least in the past, taught use of force for the Law Enforcement Training Institute at the University of Missouri,
Yes.
and you taught defensive tactics to the National Animal Control Association,
Yes.
to the Boone County Sheriff's Department,
Yes.
to Boone County Animal Control,
Yes.
and to various other departments around the state.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I would tender this gentleman as an expert in defensive tactics.
I object, he was never disclosed to me as an expert.
I'm sorry, didn't hear you.
I object, he was never disclosed to me as an expert.
How does he get disclosed as being an expert?
Scott has to tell me.
This is not civil litigation. There are no rules of discovery. Otherwise, it would be taking depositions in these sorts of cases.
We'd like to hear from him. So we're going, I don't know, we'll decide if he's an expert or not. Our opinion, if we get more from him.
Take it, I'm overruled.
Pardon me?
Take it, I'm overruled.
I'm going to hear from him. That's okay.
Can you describe for us what the general principles of PPCT are?
That is a system that's designed around legal acceptability, tactical acceptability, and medical acceptability.
And does it employ something called the fluid shockwave principle?
Yes.
And what is that?
The fluid shockwave principle is a concept trying to explain how to best transfer energy when utilizing a technique. It is something that's been around for centuries that the founder of PPCT has put together in order to explain how it works.
And the founder of PPCT is Bruce Siddle?
Yes.
In the trenches, what does fluid shockwave principle mean?
It's using 100% of total power when you're doing a technique.
And why is it that you use 100% of your power when you do a given technique?
There's several reasons, such as you need to end the confrontation that you're trying to overcome by using force immediately so as not to expose either you or the suspect to further chances of injury. and it's to protect others that you may be trying to defend as well.
The bottom line is you use all your strength when you deliver,
Correct.
whether it's a baton strike, or a knee strike, or a push.
Yes.
What's the 1+1 theory?
The 1+1 theory is a concept that utilizes empty hand control as well as other implements that are accessible to law enforcement officers. The concept is the idea of an officer may utilize one step above whatever equal level of resistance the offender is offering so as to overcome their resistance. It's another way to explain that we use only that amount of force that is reasonably necessary.
And so ultimately, if an officer is justified in using force, makes the decision to use force, then the effort put into that force is 100%.
When the decision is made, it should be at 100% application, yes.
Now, you also trained officers in the clamp and grasp techniques. Is that true?
That I have.
What are those?
Clamp and grasp was created by the LEST company, law enforcement standards training. Can't remember exactly what it stands for, but it's a arm manipulation and ground fighting program.
So the Columbia Police Department's use of force protocol sort of wraps a couple of different technique systems into it, yes?
We try to, yes.
So there is not a specific limited universe of techniques that are available.
What do you mean?
Well, PPCT teaches a one-hand palm heel strike, right? You hit somebody right here as hard as you can.
Yes.
Okay. But that doesn't mean that using two hands falls outside of the Columbia Police Department use of force protocol.
Not at that time.
Now, Sergeant, would you agree with me that officers are trained to maintain an advantage whenever possible in order to establish and maintain control of the subject?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that officers are trained that they must sometimes be the aggressor in order to establish and maintain control?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that officers are trained to end a struggle and control the subject as quickly as possible?
Yes.
And would you agree with me that officers must make use of force decisions based on what they believe the facts to be at the time?
Correct.
Before officers apply force, do you train them to give a suspect an opportunity to get ready for it?
What do you mean get ready for it? If possible, we're supposed to give a verbal warning, but if that's only possible.
Okay. If you're going to deliver a palm heel strike to somebody, do you tell them, hey, I'm about to shove you?
No.
Why is that?
You give them verbal commands to try and de-escalate if possible, but when it comes time to act, knowing that verbal de-escalation techniques aren't working, then you have to act instead of delaying, giving them the opportunity to overcome you.
Because if you go half speed or you give them a chance to get ready for what's coming, the chances of having a more prolonged encounter are increased.
Correct.
Okay. As a law enforcement officer and a defensive tactics training instructor, what is a 2-minute fight like with a suspect?
Exhausting.
So somebody who can take on 2 officers for 2 minutes plus is somebody to be very wary of.
I would think so.
Okay. Prior to August 15th of 2011, had the Columbia Police Department ever trained its officers on how to put uncooperative subjects on a holding cell ring?
On the ring, no.
Okay. Did you train them somehow on how to engage an uncooperative subject in a cell?
At one point in time, I did, yes.
And do you recall when that was?
I know it was mid-90s, early to mid-90s, and it was during clamp and grasp training.
Okay. And what technique was taught?
I don't remember the name of it, but it required officers to move into the holding cell in a single file line with the intent to gain control of the subject by pinning him up against the wall.
So essentially multiple officers with at least, somebody's got to be in the front, right?
Yes,
Okay. And that person is going to essentially bull rush the subject and drive him in or her into the back wall of the cell, yes?
if they're not already against the wall, they'd have to push them up against the wall.
Okay. And the officers were not to do this at half speed, right?
Correct.
Okay. And Columbia Police Department doesn't have shields or entry shields or helmets or anything like that for its holding cells, right?
SWAT team had it, but not for the holding cells.
Okay. So in this technique that was taught for entering a cell, there was 100% risk of the subject being driven forcefully into the back wall, correct?
If that technique was conducted,
If that
yes.
technique was conducted. They were not limited to that technique.
Correct.
Is the door frame on the cells wide enough to really get more than one person through at a time?
I don't believe so.
If one of your officers, one of the CPD officers, goes into a cell with an uncooperative subject and that person starts to fight, what are the dangers?
When an officer goes in the holding cell, with the exception of their firearm that's locked in a lockbox, they still have all their tools accessible on their duty belt, which means they can access it, but if they go within arm's reach of the suspect can also reach their duty belt. They have the chance of colliding with either the wall, which are cinder blocks, with the concrete floor or the concrete bench that is in it. And in certain holding cells, there's also a toilet and a fountain that they could contact while engaged in some kind of physical confrontation or something.
And what happens to that risk of injury to somebody as you add more people to the room?
It's a very limited space. It's hard to add additional individuals inside of the room. It gets really cramped and it's hard to maneuver.
And so if there are 3 officers trying to fight with one person, or let me rephrase that. If one person is trying to fight with 3 officers, it's even more risky that somebody's going to get thrown into something, crash into something.
It's possible.
Okay. And there's a greater risk of injury to somebody.
It's possible.
Might be the officer, might be the subject. Okay. As of August 2011, it was the policy and the practice of the police department to handcuff subjects to the holding cell ring when they refused to stop banging on a cell door, correct?
We didn't have policy, but that was the practice.
Right. Okay. That was the expectation, is that that person went on the ring, yes?
In most cases, yes.
In your experience as the defensive tactics lead instructor, did you find that officers would sometimes use a leg sweep to take somebody down and then get them on a ring?
I've known that to happen, yes.
And that requires some assessment by the officer about what kind of room do I have, how is this going to work, where are we going to end up?
Why are we talking about leg sweeps and pushing somebody into the wall when it's not relevant, because it's not what happened at all?
Because it goes to the totality of the circumstances about what's considered and then what's done.
I think it goes to the question I asked earlier, what options were available other than pushing somebody against the wall? So I'd like to hear the answer to the rule.
It is possible to do a leg sweep, but they would have to look at where they are in the holding cell, what chances of him, such as if they were by the concrete bench or if they were by the door frame or by the toilet or the water fountain. It all depends on how much room they have to maneuver on, whether that would be more risky or not.
And so does it ultimately boil down to the officer's assessment of whether they can do that move in a safe manner depending on where the person is?
That's always up to the officer.
Now, those sorts of
New
assessments,
message from Stacey Harris.
sorry, those sorts of assessments, they happen quickly, don't they?
Correct.
Okay. Is a leg sweep a form of balance displacement?
Yes.
And is balance displacement a technique that's taught in PPCT?
It's a concept, more of a technique, but yes.
And the concept is you knock somebody off balance, get them down on their bottom or something like that, and get in a position of superior strength to them.
Displace their center of gravity, yes.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that an officer who assesses a situation and makes a choice that they think is the least dangerous for everybody involved, that they're acting precisely in the manner in which you trained them?
That's correct.
Okay. So at the request of Internal Affairs, did you review Rob Sanders' use of force in a holding cell against Kenny Baker that occurred on August 15th, 2011?
Yes.
Now, you also had a previous conversation with with Officer Sanders about that too, didn't you?
Yes.
He came to you and said, hey, this is what went on, what do you think about this?
He had me read through his report to see what happened and if it sounded appropriate.
Okay. Did he try to influence your decision in any way?
No.
Okay. Did he try to pressure you into saying, hey, don't get on my side, man, come on, we're buddies?
No.
And you wouldn't do that anyway, would you? You would make the impartial assessment that you would expect somebody else to make of use of force.
I'd remain objective, yeah.
And then when Internal Affairs asked you to review it, did you evaluate Rob Sanders' use of force in the holding cell from the perspective of the PPCT system?
Yes.
Did you evaluate it from the perspective of the training that's provided to Columbia police officers?
Yes.
In your assessment as a PPCT and a defensive tactics instructor, did the push that Rob employed in the holding cell fall within the department's use of force policy?
Yes.
Did it fall within the department's use of force procedures?
Yes.
Did it fall within the training and the concepts that were employed by the Columbia Police Department?
Within the concepts, yes.
Okay. Was it an appropriate technique for trying to displace Mr. Baker's balance?
I believe so.
Was it proper for Rob to use all his strength when he did it?
Yes.
And as the PPCT trainer and the defensive tactics lead instructor, what would you expect the results to be of a push like the one administered by Rob Sanders?
My expectation would be that he would fall to the ground.
Is it a likely result that the person would be driven backwards all the way into the back wall and strike their head in the manner that Mr. Baker did?
Obviously, it's possible, but it's not something I would expect.
With somebody like Kenny Baker, who's already shown the ability and the propensity to violently fight for a prolonged period of time, who's verbally aggressive and non-compliant with commands, is a push in a holding cell a justified maneuver to avoid having to get into another lengthy fight?
Yes.
Okay. We mentioned Bruce Siddle before, the founder of PPCT, or whatever it happens to be called right now. Have you by chance discussed this case with him?
Yes.
And does he?
I object, it's hearsay.
Sustained.
All right. So let me ask you, in your expert opinion, was Rob's use of force in the holding cell objectively reasonable under the totality of the circumstances?
I believe so.
Okay. And is it true that in all the factors that go into the totality of the circumstances, you have to somehow give equal weight to all of them?
Say that again?
Let me rephrase it. If you've got 10 factors, size of the subject, mental state, those sorts of things. If there's 10 of those, do you have to say, okay, this gets 10%, and this gets 10%, and this gets 10%?
You have to consider all of them. I don't know if you would divide your attention necessarily to one more than the other. As far as seriousness goes, for instance, if somebody had a gun, I mean, that's going to take precedence in your evaluation more so than if somebody had no weapons in their hand.
So if a 50-pound woman, child, has a gun, just because they're a child doesn't mean you take it less seriously.
Correct, you gotta, because of the weapon, you have to react to the weapon. But
And-
you do have to take into account the fact that they are a 50-pound child.
Sure. But that fact alone doesn't completely mitigate the fact that you have to look at other factors as well.
Correct, you still have to evaluate all the factors.
And in a situation like this, where the officer is essentially required by the practice of the police department to use force to put somebody on the ring, in a situation like Mr. Baker's, what factors do you look at to decide whether force is appropriate?
I object, there was no evidence that he was required to use force.
That's been the testimony from a variety of witnesses, that there is an expectation.
It's not required, it's a practice.
It's an expectation.
It's a practice at that point in time.
Can you substitute the word practice?
If
Remember the
you ask
question?
again,
So I'm going to sustain you on that. It's a practice. That's what we've heard all day long.
So in a situation like the one with Mr. Baker, where it is the practice of the police department to put this gentleman on the holding cell ring and to use force to do it, what factors under the totality of the circumstances did you evaluate, did you focus on when you evaluated that use of force?
I focused on the information that was provided by Officer Sanders' perspective.
Such as what?
What he described, what was listed in the report, what was explained during interview questions, that kind of thing.
Okay. You're in charge of all the policies and procedures?
I was before my current assignment.
Okay. We've had some discussion today about a pepper mace policy. I believe it's the old
PI 008?
PI 008. Yes, sir. That's in fact been rescinded, hasn't it?
Yes.
It was rescinded several years ago, correct?
2012.
2012?
I believe that's right, 2012.
Okay.
Is when we started using Lexapol's policy.
Okay, it got wrapped into something else.
Correct.
Okay. Was it in the, just give me 1 second to pull something, if I can find it again. We've had some discussion about the restraint and control device policy as well. Do you recognize that?
SOG, yeah.
And what's the effective date of that?
It's June 1st of 2011.
Then the review date is May of 2012.
That's when it was scheduled to be.
Reviewed.
Correct.
Okay. So does this refresh your recollection as to when that policy was rescinded?
This policy was not rescinded when that was in place, no. They were enacted at the same time.
Oh, they were at the same time, they were both in effect?
Yes.
Okay. And the restraint and control devices policy also has a section about chemical irritant sprays.
Yes.
And are the requirements for helping someone alleviate the effects of pepper spray the same, to your knowledge, between the two policies?
I can't remember exactly if they are the same or not.
If you ever take a look at that and see if that refreshes your recollection.
They are not the same. They're similar, but they're not the same.
The restraint control policy simply says you can remove someone from the contaminated area, correct? There's not.
You may provide them with a decontamination wipe if one is available.
Those are the Sudicon wipes we've heard about.
I believe yes.
Okay, I'll take that back, please. Now, you are let me ask you, are you pretty good friends with Krista Schaus-Jones?
Yes.
Okay. Good friends?
Yes.
Okay. And with her and her husband, who's also a police officer, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Not the Sergeant Jones we had here earlier from Internal Affairs, correct? Different
Correct.
Jones.
That was Jason Jones.
Okay. When you did this review for the Internal Affairs Division, did you allow your friendship with Lieutenant Schaus-Jones to somehow color or influence your opinion?
I don't think I ever talked to her about it. I only talked with Jason Jones and Lloyd Simons.
Okay. And are the opinions that you hold with respect to Rob's use of force that day given to a reasonable degree of defensive tactics expertise?
Say that again?
are the opinions that you've given with respect to Rob's use of force, do you give those within a reasonable degree of defensive tactics expertise?
Yes.
Nothing further, thank you.
Cross-examine?
So both of those pepper spray policies were in effect.
I believe so, yes.
And if they're both in effect, you'd follow both of them.
We would try to file both, yes.
And you would consider all the factors, always, when you're weighing out the totality of the circumstances, isn't that true?
That's what I teach, yes.
Except maybe under Missouri law, in a tort case, it's only reasonableness, isn't that right? Not in the federal realm, but in just Missouri law, it's just reasonableness that's considered.
I don't understand the difference.
Well, objective reasonableness and all the factors are slightly different than just a common reasonableness standard, isn't that true?
That I'm not sure.
Okay. The city could make a policy that says just has to be reasonable. And
Absolutely.
we would enforce that and you'd expect officers to follow. Is that true?
Yeah.
Sanders resistance was considered passive resistance, is that what you found?
Sanders resistance?
Oh, sorry, I apologize, Baker's resistance. I'm getting tired.
I would classify that as passive resistance, yes.
So it was 1+1 to use the kind of force that Sanders exhibited when he launched him into the wall?
To understand the 1+1 theory, it's not, there's a graphic inside the PBCT manual, and some people make the mistake of looking at that graphic and drawing a straight line across to see where the 1+1 comes in, and that is not a correct application. That's not what that graphic is supposed to represent. 1+1 is if all things being equal, then we're allowed to use one step above. That's where the 1+1 theory comes in. So it's not necessarily based on the graphic, because I don't think in my 15 years I've ever come across a situation where all things being equal had actually occurred. So you have to add in a whole bunch of variables and stuff like that to try and determine all things being equal, this is what it would be, and then I would use one level higher to overcome that amount of resistance.
But the Columbia Police Department doesn't use the force continuum anymore, and isn't that part of this? Or am I mistaken?
What do you mean doesn't use the force continuum?
I thought that we didn't use a force continuum anymore.
It's never been in policy, and it's still not in policy, but I do teach it.
Why would you teach something that's not in our policy?
To get the officers to understand exactly what objective reasonableness is. A force continuum is simply a tool, a mechanism for me to try and teach a very complex topic, concept.
But an application of that concept could be outside of the policy.
Are you asking, is it or can it be?
Can it be?
I don't know of any situations where it has.
But it could be.
I don't think so. I think the force continuum is designed to be very restrictive, so it doesn't. However, if a department wrote a very restrictive policy saying you can only apply handcuffs and you can't use a baton, well then of course, yes, it would violate the force continuum.
The standard for use of force is simple in that an officer uses only the amount of force reasonably necessary to achieve a legitimate law enforcement purpose. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you agree that it would be improper for an officer to punish a subject for their past behavior?
Yes.
And you would agree that gratuitous force can't be used?
That's correct.
And you even teach about gratuitous force in your use of force training materials in section 4.1. That's part of your training, isn't it?
I include that, yes.
And gratuitous force is never acceptable, that's correct, right?
Correct, gratuitous force is not.
In evaluating the appropriate level of force, you always have to determine the level of the imminent threat.
I think that's correct. I kind of don't understand exactly what you're asking.
Okay. Is handcuffing force?
Yes,
So that is a very low level of force that you might use?
yes,
Okay. Did you understand what I was getting at then?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. And in this case, you were not Rob Sanders' supervisor, correct?
I was not a supervisor at that time, no.
But he did ask you to review his report.
Correct.
And you basically told him, yeah, I think it's okay.
At that time, yeah.
And then you were asked by Internal Affairs to come back and look at the same instance that you've already kind of reviewed and said was okay.
Correct.
Do you think that's the right thing to do?
It was requested of me, so I did.
You also reviewed the video, right?
I did.
We can agree that the video showed that Baker is secure in his cell, is that correct?
Yes.
And we can agree that he suffered from medical effects of pepper mace.
I can't get that from the video.
You couldn't tell that he was suffering from the effects of mace from the video?
All I could see is that he was bent over
Did you otherwise know that he was suffering from the effects of pepper mace?
from reading the report.
Okay. And you're aware of the effects of pepper mace?
Yes.
You're aware, I guess, from reading the report that he was also intoxicated?
I think so, but I can't remember for sure.
But if he was, that goes to some of the factors, isn't that true?
You included, yeah.
You were talking about this tactic where you come in and push people into the cell a little bit ago. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And is the tactic to come in and kind of grab them chest to chest or like this and push them straight? So they're going into the cell with their back like this, so the other officers can come and grab the arms from the sides?
That's pretty close. We don't have our hands out. We keep our hands up, protecting our head, and our forearms go against their chest. But yeah, that's about right.
But that tactic is a lot different than a vertical launch, which kind of happened in this case. That tactic was not what happened here.
Well, I'll object to the use of the word tactic, because there's been no evidence that it was Rob's tactic to push him back against the wall.
I'm discussing what he talked earlier, and they're saying that, hey, this is an acceptable tactic, and I'm trying to get to the expert and say, look, this is not what was even going on.
Whether it's a tactic or a method, something happened, so we'll move on.
So that discussion didn't apply in this case.
He did not use that grasp technique, correct? I don't believe he did anyway.
So there was really no reason to consider it.
The grasp technique?
Yeah.
Not that I had, no.
And why was it in the report?
What, I'm object as speculation and vague. I don't follow the question.
Was it in the report or not?
What do you mean?
It was in the front of his report. He talks about clamp and grasp. I'll find it. Do you remember talking about clamp and grasp in your report?
I believe